The Arizona Territory stretched out like a sunburnt canvas beneath Margaret Bennett's tired eyes. The vast expanse of dusty plains and jagged mountains seeming to mock her journey. But 45, the lines etched into her once smooth face, told stories of hardship that no proper Boston lady should have endured. Her husband Thomas had been dead 3 months now. The silver mine he dragged her west to claim, having yielded nothing but his grave when the shaft collapsed. The stagecoach rattled violently as it hit another rut in the poorly maintained road, jolting Margaret from her dark thoughts. Ahead lay the frontier town of Copper Springs, a place she'd never intended to see again. But desperation had a way of redrawing a person's boundaries. The leather bag clutched in her lap contained everything she had left in the world: $3.72, a deed to worthless land, and a letter from her estranged brother offering sanctuary if she could reach him in California. "Copper Springs coming up, folks," the driver called down, his voice carrying over the rhythmic pounding of hooves. "Last stop before nightfall." I'd like to kindly ask you to subscribe to our channel. And I'm curious, what city are you watching from? Margaret adjusted her worn bonnet, conscious of how far she'd fallen from the society woman she once was. Her dress, once fine navy cotton, had faded to a nondescript blue-gray after too many washings in harsh lye soap. As the stagecoach rolled into town, she observed how Copper Springs had grown in the 3 years since Thomas had declared it not fit for rats and moved them further west. A proper hotel now stood where a tent saloon had once been, and the main street boasted wooden sidewalks on both sides. The coach lurched to a halt before a dusty building with a freshly painted sign declaring it the Copper Springs Station, and Margaret steeled herself for the decision that lay ahead. She could spend precious coins on a room for the night, or she could save her money and sleep on a bench in the station until the westbound stage departed tomorrow. The question came from a tall figure who had materialized beside the coach, his face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. When Margaret nodded, he extended calloused hands to help her descend, and she caught a glimpse of his face, weathered and tanned, with eyes as dark as river stones. He wasn't white, she realized with a start. His features spoke of native blood, though his clothes were those of a frontiersman. A strange silver medallion hung from a leather cord around his neck, catching the late afternoon sunlight. "Name's Samuel Greyhorse," he said, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture that seemed both respectful and ironic. "Station manager, you staying in town or catching the westbound?" "Westbound," Margaret replied, trying not to betray her discomfort. Thomas had filled her head with terrible stories about the Apache and other tribes, tales of scalping and torture that had haunted her dreams during their first months in the territory. But this man's steady gaze held neither threat nor particular interest in her, just the professional courtesy of someone doing his job. "Tomorrow's coach," she added, calculating whether she could afford both food and shelter. The decision must have shown on her face, for Samuel Greyhorse studied her with quiet assessment. Something in his expression suggested he recognized the particular brand of desperation that clung to her like trail dust. He nodded once, as if confirming something to himself. "Stage don't leave till 4 tomorrow," he said, his voice measured and calm. "Station's got a back room with a cot. Not fancy, but it's free for passengers with tickets. Save your coins for a hot meal at Ma Wilson's place across the way." He gestured toward a small building with smoke curling from its chimney, despite the heat of the day. "Best stew in the territory, or so folks claim." Before Margaret could respond, he turned to help another passenger, leaving her standing in the swirling dust with her small bag and a strange feeling that she'd been weighed and measured by those dark, perceptive eyes. Something about his calm authority made her wonder about the story behind the man. How a Native American had come to be running a white man's stagecoach station in a frontier town that likely hadn't existed when he was born. The sun was beginning its descent behind the distant mountains, painting the sky in violent streaks of orange and purple that reminded Margaret of bruises. She made her way across the rutted main street toward Ma Wilson's, mindful of her worn boot heels on the uneven ground. The smell of simmering meat and vegetables grew stronger as she approached, making her mouth water and her stomach clench painfully. Inside, the establishment was simple but clean. 6 rough-hewn tables with benches, walls decorated with faded illustrations from newspapers, and a large stone fireplace where a cast-iron pot bubbled contentedly. A stout woman with iron-gray hair, pulled into a severe bun, looked up from wiping down a table and assessed Margaret with the same straightforward appraisal Samuel Greyhorse had demonstrated. "Evenin'," the woman said, her voice neither friendly nor hostile. "You'll be wanting supper, I expect. 25 cents for stew, cornbread, and coffee." She named a price that would deplete Margaret's meager funds more than she'd hoped, but the smell alone was enough to override financial caution. Margaret nodded and took a seat at an empty table, setting her bag carefully at her feet. As Ma Wilson disappeared into what must have been a kitchen area, Margaret became aware of the room's other occupants. 2 men in dusty trail clothes at one table, speaking in low tones over half-empty plates, and a solitary figure in the corner, whose face was obscured by the brim of his hat. Something about the stillness of that figure made the hair on Margaret's neck rise, an animal instinct warning of danger that seemed absurd in this humble eating establishment. Night had fully descended by the time Margaret finished her meal, which had been every bit as satisfying as Samuel Greyhorse had suggested. She dabbed at her mouth with a handkerchief that had once been fine linen, but was now thin from repeated laundering. 25 cents poorer, but fortified by the best meal she'd had in weeks. Margaret gathered her bag and stepped back into the street. Lanterns now glowed in windows up and down the main thoroughfare, and the sounds of a piano and raucous laughter spilled from the saloon at the far end. She would avoid that direction, she decided, not wanting to encounter drunken cowboys or miners who might see a woman alone as an invitation. As she turned toward the stage station, a shadow detached itself from the darkness beside Ma Wilson's building, and Margaret's heart lurched painfully in her chest. The distance between the town and the Apache reservation was 40 miles as the crow flew. But for Joaquin Two Knives, it might as well have been a journey to the moon. He sat astride his painted horse at the edge of Copper Springs, watching the comings and goings with eyes that missed nothing. At 53, he had lived through changes that would have seemed impossible in his youth. The Great War between the white men that had somehow increased rather than decreased their numbers in Apache territory. The coming of the Iron Horse that belched black smoke and devoured distances. And the slow, inexorable confinement of his people to the barren lands no white settler wanted. He had fought, then surrendered, then adapted, finding ways to exist in the narrow spaces between worlds. The silver medal hanging around his neck, given to him by a blue-coated officer in recognition of his service as a scout, was both a shield and a mark of shame among his own people. Samuel Greyhorse was his sister's son, a young man who had chosen to walk more fully in the white man's world than Joaquin ever could. They shared blood, but Samuel had advantages Joaquin lacked: youth, education at the white man's school, and a face that could pass for Mexican when it served him. Joaquin had come to town for reasons that were not entirely clear even to himself. Ostensibly, he was there to trade. He had brought beautifully tanned deerskins that would fetch decent prices at the general store. But something else had drawn him, a feeling like the electric tension in the air before a storm. The shaman who had taught him the old ways would have called it a vision-seeking, but Joaquin had long ago stopped trying to explain his instincts in traditional terms. He simply knew when to move and when to be still, when to speak and when to listen. Today, something had called him to Copper Springs. From his vantage point, he had watched the stagecoach arrive and the passengers disembark. The woman in the faded blue dress had caught his attention immediately, not because of any particular beauty, though her bearing suggested she had once been handsome, but because of the particular quality of her desperation. Joaquin had seen that look before, in the eyes of his own people, when the last of their traditional lands had been taken, when the last free bands had been forced onto the reservation. It was the look of someone who had lost everything, but refused to acknowledge defeat. It was the look of someone dangerous, not to others necessarily, but to themselves. She had disappeared into Ma Wilson's place, and now, hours later, she emerged alone into the growing darkness. Joaquin nudged his horse forward, staying in the shadows. He had not planned to speak with the woman, but the same instinct that had brought him to town now urged him to follow. The shadow that had detached itself from beside the building resolved into the figure of a man, tall and rail-thin, with a face like a hatchet beneath a bowler hat. "Evening, ma'am," he said, his voice carrying the nasal twang of the East. "Might I have a word?" Margaret clutched her bag tighter and took an involuntary step backward. The man raised his hands in a placating gesture that did nothing to ease her tension. "Name's Elias Pinkerton. I believe I knew your late husband." The mention of Thomas sent a jolt through Margaret's body, part surprise, part suspicion. She had told no one in town of her circumstances or her connection to Thomas Bennett. The man must have noticed her reaction, for he smiled, revealing teeth stained by tobacco. "Thomas Bennett, wasn't it? Shame about that mine collapse. Terrible business." "How did you know who I am?" Margaret demanded, her voice steadier than she felt. Around them, the town continued its evening activities, oblivious to the confrontation happening in the shadows between Ma Wilson's and the general store. Pinkerton took a step closer, and Margaret caught the smell of whiskey and something else, a chemical odor that reminded her of the photographer's studio in Boston, where she'd once sat for a portrait. "Did you know Thomas?" she asked when Pinkerton didn't immediately answer her first question. A memory surfaced, Thomas mentioning a business partner named Pinkerton who had provided initial funding for the silver mine. A partner who had mysteriously vanished when the first assays showed less promising results than expected. "You're the man who abandoned him," she said, realization dawning. "You left him to dig that shaft alone." The night seemed to close in around Margaret, as Elias Pinkerton's thin lips stretched into what might generously be called a smile. "Now that's a harsh way to frame a simple business decision," he said, the affected politeness in his tone doing nothing to mask the coldness beneath. "Investments sometimes don't pan out. I cut my losses." He took another step toward her, and Margaret became acutely aware of how alone they were in this slice of darkness between buildings. But that's ancient history. What interests me now is what Thomas might have told you before his unfortunate accident. The way he said accident sent a chill down Margaret's spine, and suddenly, Thomas's death, which she had mourned as a tragic mining mishap, took on a more sinister aspect in her mind. Had it truly been an accident? Or had Elias Pinkerton returned to ensure that whatever Thomas had discovered in that mine remained buried with him? "I don't know what you mean," Margaret said, fighting to keep the tremor from her voice. "Thomas told me nothing of his business affairs. He considered such matters unsuitable for a wife's ears." This was only partially true. While Thomas had indeed kept much from her, in his final weeks he had become increasingly agitated, staying up late, poring over maps, and making cryptic notations in a leather-bound journal. That journal was now among Margaret's meager possessions in her bag, though she had never been able to make sense of its contents. The thought of the journal made her clutch her bag even tighter, an action that did not escape Pinkerton's notice. His eyes, pale and cold as winter ice, flicked down to her white-knuckled grip on the leather satchel, and his smile widened fractionally. "I find that hard to believe, Mrs. Bennet," Pinkerton said, dropping all pretense of cordiality. Thomas was many things, but close-mouthed wasn't one of them, especially after a whiskey or two. He reached out suddenly, his bony fingers closing around Margaret's wrist with surprising strength. "Why don't we continue this conversation somewhere more private? I have a room at the hotel, and I think you'll find I can be quite generous to those who cooperate." The implication in his words and the proprietary way his thumb pressed against her pulse point made bile rise in Margaret's throat. She tried to pull away, but his grip only tightened, the tips of his fingers digging painfully into her flesh. "Don't make a scene, Mrs. Bennet," Pinkerton hissed, his face now inches from hers. "It would be a shame if the good people of Copper Springs were to learn about Thomas's indiscretions." A soft sound, like the whisper of moccasins on sand, was the only warning before a new presence materialized from the deeper shadows. "The woman doesn't want to go with you." The voice was deep and calm, carrying the slight accent that Margaret recognized from her earlier encounter with Samuel Greyhorse. But this was not the station manager. The man who now stood a few paces away was older, his face deeply lined and his long hair streaked with silver. Like Samuel, he wore white man's clothes, a worn buckskin jacket over simple cotton shirt and trousers. But there was nothing assimilated about his bearing. He stood with the quiet confidence of a mountain lion, and his dark eyes, reflecting the distant lantern light, held a similar predatory assessment. The silver medallion at his throat gleamed dully. Pinkerton's grip on Margaret's wrist slackened slightly as he turned to face the newcomer. The arrival of the Apache made Elias Pinkerton reassess his situation with the cold calculation that had served him well in business and other, less savory endeavors. "This is a private conversation," he said, the edge in his voice betraying his irritation at the interruption. "Move along, Injun." The slur was deliberate, meant to establish dominance in a frontier town. Your Native Americans existed on sufferance at best. Joaquin Two Knives did not move. Instead, he shifted his weight almost imperceptibly, a motion that somehow managed to convey both relaxation and readiness. Pinkerton's free hand drifted toward the inner pocket of his coat, where Margaret guessed he carried a pistol. The tension in the air thickened, and Margaret found herself holding her breath, caught between two dangerous men with unknown intentions. "Let her go," Joaquin said, his voice unchanged in its calm certainty. There was no threat in the words, only the clear expectation of compliance. Something in that tone made Margaret think of a man who had given orders and expected them to be followed. A military man, perhaps, though not in any white army she knew of. Pinkerton's fingers flexed around her wrist, then released her altogether, as he evidently decided that a confrontation in the open was not to his advantage. He stepped back, straightening his bowler hat with a theatrical gesture that did nothing to disguise the malice in his pale eyes. "Another time, Mrs. Bennet," he said, his gaze flicking from Margaret to Joaquin and back again. "Our business isn't finished." With that, he turned and walked away, his gait unnaturally stiff, as if it cost him something to show his back to them. Once Pinkerton had disappeared around the corner, Margaret released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her wrist throbbed where his fingers had dug into her flesh, and she rubbed it absently, aware of the Apache's steady gaze. "Thank you," she said, uncertain how else to acknowledge what had just transpired. Joaquin inclined his head slightly in acknowledgement, but said nothing. In the silence that followed, Margaret found herself studying him more openly than propriety would normally allow. He was not a young man. She guessed he was older than her by several years, but he carried himself with the fluid grace of someone half his age. The lines in his face spoke of sun and wind rather than worry or anger, and his eyes, though watchful, held none of the predatory calculation she had seen in Pinkerton's. "You should not walk alone at night," Joaquin finally said, the statement delivered without judgment or condescension. "That man means you harm." Margaret nodded, suddenly weary beyond words. The confrontation had drained what little energy her meal had provided, and the reality of her situation crashed down upon her with renewed force. She was alone in a frontier town with almost no money, a westbound ticket that wouldn't depart until tomorrow afternoon, and now, apparently, an enemy who believed she possessed information worth threatening her for. As if reading her thoughts, Joaquin gestured toward the stagecoach station. "My nephew runs the station. You will be safe there tonight." He did not offer to escort her, instead waiting for her decision with the patient stillness that seemed to be his natural state. Margaret hesitated only briefly before nodding. "Your nephew, that would be Mr. Greyhorse?" she asked, making the connection. Joaquin's expression softened almost imperceptibly at the mention of Samuel, a brief glimpse of familial pride quickly masked. He nodded once. "He mentioned a cot in the back room," Margaret continued, adjusting her grip on her bag. "I think I will take him up on that offer." She took a step toward the station, then paused, turning back to the Apache. "May I ask your name, sir?" The formality sounded strange even to her own ears, but it was the only language she had for expressing gratitude to a stranger who had potentially saved her from a fate she preferred not to contemplate. The corner of Joaquin's mouth twitched in what might have been amusement at being addressed as "sir" by a white woman. "Joachim," he said simply, offering neither surname nor further explanation. "Go now. Vest." There was something in his tone that suggested he would watch to ensure she reached the station safely, though he made no move to follow her. Margaret nodded again and began walking toward the station, her steps quickening as she left the shadows. She did not look back, but she felt his gaze on her until she reached the pool of lantern light spilling from the station's windows. Inside, Samuel Greyhorse looked up from a ledger he was writing in, his expression changing subtly as he noted her disheveled appearance and the way she clutched her bag. He asked no questions, merely nodded toward a door at the back of the room. "Cots made up," he said, returning to his ledger as if her arrival in a state of obvious distress was a common occurrence. Perhaps, Margaret reflected as she closed the door of the small, plain room behind her. In a place like Copper Springs, it was. The cot was narrow but clean, with a surprisingly soft quilt laid across it. A small window, securely latched, looked out onto the darkness behind the station. Margaret set her bag carefully at the foot of the cot and sank down onto the edge of the thin mattress, suddenly overcome by the events of the day. She had left the mining camp where Thomas had died with the simple goal of reaching her brother in California, a journey of survival, not adventure. Now, barely into the first leg of that journey, she found herself caught in some mysterious business involving her late husband, a threatening former partner, and a pair of Apache men whose motives remained unclear. Her hands trembled as she untied her bonnet and set it aside, then bent to unlace her boots. What had Thomas gotten himself into? And more importantly, what had he left her to face alone? The journal. The thought came suddenly, and Margaret reached for her bag, withdrawing the small leather-bound volume that had been among Thomas's personal effects. She had looked through it many times since his death, trying to make sense of the cramped handwriting and cryptic notations. But tonight, she examined it with fresh eyes, wondering if there might be something within its pages that explained Elias Pinkerton's interest. The first half of the journal contained what she would have expected: detailed records of mining operations, expenses, and occasional geological observations, written in the educated hand of a man who had once been a professor of mineralogy before the lure of frontier wealth had drawn him west. But the latter pages, dated in the weeks before his death, grew increasingly erratic. Maps with no clear reference points, strings of numbers with no explanations, and fragmented sentences that hinted at something far more valuable than silver. One entry, dated just 3 days before the mine collapse, caught her eye. "EP doesn't know. Must keep it hidden until I'm certain. Not silver at all." The initials, EP, must refer to Elias Pinkerton, Margaret realized with a chill. Thomas had discovered something in that mine, something he had deliberately kept from his partner. The next entry was even more cryptic. "Sample confirmed. God help me. This changes everything." The final entry, dated the day before Thomas died, consisted of a single line. "Told Jay, he will know what to do if anything happens to me." Jay. Who was Jay? Margaret racked her brain, trying to recall if Thomas had ever mentioned a friend or associate with that initial, but nothing came to mind. She closed the journal, more confused than enlightened, and tucked it back into her bag. Whatever secret Thomas had discovered, it had likely died with him, unless Jay was real and not some fevered invention of a man obsessed with his failing mine. Sleep came fitfully to Margaret that night, her dreams filled with dark mine shafts, Thomas's voice calling from depths she couldn't reach, and the glint of something precious just beyond her grasp. She woke before dawn, disoriented in the unfamiliar room, the events of the previous day rushing back as her consciousness fully returned. Through the small window, She could see the sky beginning to lighten, the stars fading as night reluctantly gave way to morning. She rose, straightened her rumpled dress as best she could, and rebraided her hair, using a small hand mirror from her bag to ensure she looked presentable. The westbound stage wouldn't leave until late afternoon, which left her with hours to fill, and the problem of avoiding Elias Pinkerton in a town too small to hide in for long. When Margaret emerged from the back room, she found the station empty except for Samuel Greyhorse, who was stoking a small fire in the iron stove that occupied one corner. The smell of coffee filled the room, rich and inviting. Samuel glanced up at her entrance, but said nothing, returning his attention to the fire. Margaret hesitated, uncertain of the protocol in this situation. Was she expected to leave immediately, or was she welcome to linger in the relative safety of the station? As if sensing her uncertainty, Samuel straightened and gestured toward a pot on the stove. "Coffee's hot," he said, the offer simple but genuine. No charge for passengers. Margaret murmured her thanks and accepted the tin cup he filled for her, warming her hands around it. "Your uncle," she began, then faltered, unsure how to frame her question. "He helped me last night. There was a man." Samuel raised a hand, cutting her off with a gesture that somehow managed to be both respectful and firm. His expression had changed at the mention of Joaquin, becoming more guarded. Margaret realized she had stumbled into territory more complex than she had anticipated. "I just wanted to thank him," she finished lamely, taking a sip of the strong, bitter coffee to cover her discomfort. Samuel studied her for a moment, his dark eyes unreadable, before nodding once as if coming to a decision. He moved to the station's front door, opened it, and looked out into the street, then closed it again. "My uncle doesn't come into town often," Samuel said, his voice low, as if sharing a confidence. "When he does, it means trouble is coming." There was no dramatic emphasis in his delivery, just a simple statement of fact that Margaret found more unsettling than any dire warning might have been. Samuel returned to the stove, refilling his own cup before continuing. "The man who bothered you last night, Pinkerton, he's been asking questions about a mine collapse west of here." "Your husband's mine." It wasn't a question, and Margaret didn't bother to deny the connection. Samuel seemed to already know more about her situation than she had shared with anyone in town. Pinkerton believes there was something valuable in that mine, something worth killing for. Margaret's hands tightened around her cup, the heat almost painful against her palms. "Did you know my husband?" she asked, the question barely above a whisper. Samuel shook his head, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes that suggested the answer wasn't as simple as a denial. "But you know something about his death?" Margaret pressed, setting her cup down on a nearby table with a decisive click. "Please, Mr. Greyhorse, I have almost nothing left in this world. At least give me the truth." The plea seemed to reach something in Samuel, for his expression softened almost imperceptibly, and he sighed, running a hand over his close-cropped hair in a gesture that reminded Margaret, incongruously, of her brother when faced with a particularly difficult decision. "I know that your husband found something in that mine that frightened him," Samuel said finally. "I know that he sought out my uncle just days before he died, and I know that Pinkerton has been searching for something ever since the accident." The way Samuel emphasized the last word confirmed Margaret's growing suspicion that Thomas's death had been no accident at all. "What I don't know," Samuel continued, holding her gaze steadily, "is whether you're carrying what Pinkerton is looking for." His eyes flickered to her bag, then back to her face, the question unspoken but clear. Margaret felt a surge of defensive anger, followed quickly by the cold clarity of realization. If Samuel, and by extension his uncle Joaquin, believed she might have whatever Thomas had discovered, then Pinkerton certainly believed the same. "I have nothing but Thomas's journal," Margaret said, deciding that honesty was her best course with the only people who seemed inclined to help her. "And it makes little sense to me. Just notes about the mine, some maps I can't decipher, and mentions of something valuable that isn't silver." She hesitated, then added, "The last entry mentions someone called Jay. It says Thomas told this person about his discovery, and that Jay would know what to do if anything happened to him." Samuel's expression didn't change, but Margaret sensed a subtle shift in his attention, a sharpening of focus. "Is Jay your uncle?" she asked directly. "Was Joaquin the one Thomas confided in?" The silence that followed her question stretched long enough that Margaret began to think Samuel wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his words were careful, measured. "My uncle keeps his own counsel," Samuel said, neither confirming nor denying her suspicion. "But if your husband did speak to him, and if there is something valuable hidden in that mine, then you are in more danger than you know." He moved to the window, scanning the street outside with the cautious vigilance of a man accustomed to watching for threats. Pinkerton isn't just a businessman. Before the war, he worked for the Pinkertons. Not family, just the same name. He was dismissed for excessive violence against strikers. Since then, he's been a gun for hire when he can't make money through more legitimate means. The casual way Samuel revealed this information suggested it was common knowledge in certain circles, though Margaret had been completely ignorant of the threat until now. "What should I do?" Margaret asked, the question escaping before she could consider whether it was wise to seek advice from a man she barely knew, regardless of his apparent goodwill. Samuel turned from the window, his expression grave. For the first time, Margaret noticed the subtle bulge beneath his vest that suggested he, like many frontiermen, carried a firearm. The realization should have alarmed her, but instead, she found it oddly reassuring. If Pinkerton was as dangerous as Samuel suggested, then having armed allies, if indeed the Grey Horse men were her allies, could only improve her chances of surviving long enough to reach California. "I have a ticket for the afternoon stage," she continued, when Samuel didn't immediately respond. "Should I try to leave sooner?" "The morning stage is headed east," Samuel said, shaking his head, "and Pinkerton knows your plans. If you change them suddenly, it will only confirm his suspicions that you have something to hide." He seemed to consider the problem for a moment, then came to a decision. "Stay here until noon. I'll send word to my uncle. There may be a way to ensure your safety without altering your travel plans." Margaret wanted to ask what he meant, but Samuel's manner had become brisk and businesslike, suggesting the conversation was over for now. He moved to the door, pausing with his hand on the latch. "Don't leave the station," he advised, his tone making it clear this was not a suggestion. "And don't speak to anyone about your husband or the mine." With that, Samuel was gone, the door closing firmly behind him. Margaret was left alone in the station, the half-drunk cup of coffee cooling on the table beside her. Through the window, she could see the town beginning to stir as the sun rose higher, shopkeepers opening their doors, a wagon laden with barrels rumbling down the main street. It all seemed so ordinary, so disconnected from the dangerous undercurrents she had stumbled into. She retrieved her bag and returned to the back room, sitting on the edge of the cot with Thomas's journal open on her lap. If there was a clue to what her husband had discovered, it had to be in these pages. And if she was in as much danger as Samuel believed, then finding that clue might be her only leverage, or her only means of escape. The morning passed with excruciating slowness. Margaret remained in the back room of the station, emerging only once when she heard the eastbound stage depart in a cloud of dust and shouts. She had made little progress with Thomas's journal, though she had identified several maps that seemed to detail portions of the mine's interior rather than its location. One page in particular caught her attention, a rough sketch of what appeared to be a branch of the main shaft, marked with an X and the notation "Third Vein, West Wall, behind false stone." Was this where Thomas had hidden his discovery? If so, it was well beyond her reach now, buried beneath tons of collapsed rock and soil. Unless Pinkerton had already retrieved it, which would explain his continued interest in her, he might believe Thomas had shared the discovery with his wife. Shortly before noon, the station door opened and Samuel Greyhorse returned. Margaret had been dozing, the journal open on her lap, and she started awake at the sound. She quickly gathered her belongings, sensing from Samuel's purposeful movements that something had changed. "My uncle will meet us at the edge of town," Samuel said without preamble. "We'll take the back way, to avoid being seen." Margaret wanted to ask questions: where exactly they were going, what Joaquin had said, whether this change of plans meant she would miss her stage, but the urgency in Samuel's manner silenced her. She followed him through a rear door she hadn't noticed before, into an alley that ran behind the station and adjacent buildings. They moved quickly, Samuel leading the way with the quiet confidence of someone intimately familiar with the town's layout. The edge of town proved to be a small clearing, where the buildings of Copper Springs gave way to scrubland, dotted with mesquite and prickly pear. Joaquin Two Knives waited there, sitting astride his painted horse, with a second mount tethered nearby. He nodded once in greeting as they approached, his expression giving away nothing of his thoughts. "We don't have much time," Samuel said, turning to Margaret. "Pinkerton was asking about you at the hotel. He knows you're still in town, and he's been drinking, which makes him unpredictable." He gestured toward the second horse, a sturdy brown mare with a worn saddle. "My uncle will take you to a safe place until the stage departs. I'll remain here to make sure Pinkerton believes you're still at the station." Margaret looked from Samuel to Joaquin, uncertainty written clearly on her face. The idea of riding off into the desert with a man she barely knew, an Apache no less, when all her Eastern prejudices still whispered warnings about savages, was daunting. Yet the alternative was to face Elias Pinkerton, a man who had already demonstrated his willingness to use force and intimidation to get what he wanted. A man who may have been responsible for Thomas's death. "Will I still be able to catch the westbound stage?" she asked, practical concerns momentarily outweighing her fear. Samuel nodded, but it was Joaquin who answered, his deep voice carrying easily in the still air. "You will be at the crossing when the stage passes," Joaquin said, the promise simple but somehow reassuring. 3 hours from now, he extended a hand, offering to help her mount the mare. Margaret hesitated only briefly before accepting, allowing him to boost her onto the saddle. It had been years since she had ridden, not since leaving Boston, and she arranged her skirts as modestly as possible over the saddle, acutely aware of the impropriety of her situation. Samuel handed her bag up to her, and she secured it to the saddle horn, noting that both men seemed to be treating her belongings, and by extension, Thomas's journal, with notable care. "We must go now," Joaquin said, his tone brooking no argument. Margaret nodded, gripping the reins with hands that betrayed her nervousness. Samuel stepped back, touching the brim of his hat in farewell. "Good luck, Mrs. Bennet," he said, his expression solemn. "I hope you find what you're looking for in California." There was something in his tone that suggested he knew more about her situation than he had revealed. But before Margaret could question him, Joaquin had turned his horse and was moving away from the town at a steady trot. Margaret followed, the mare falling naturally into step behind the painted horse. They rode in silence, the sound of hoofbeats and the creak of leather the only accompaniment to their journey. The town of Copper Springs receded behind them, and soon they were surrounded by the vast, empty landscape of the Arizona Territory, a place Margaret had never learned to love despite her years living within its borders. The sun beat down with merciless intensity as they rode, following no trail that Margaret could discern. Joaquin seemed to navigate by landmarks visible only to him, occasionally altering their course slightly to skirt a rocky outcropping or to take advantage of a shallow wash that provided the only shade in the barren landscape. They had been riding for perhaps an hour when Joaquin finally slowed his pace, allowing Margaret to draw alongside him. "There is water ahead," he said, gesturing toward what looked to Margaret like nothing more than another fold in the endless desert. "We will rest there." Margaret nodded gratefully, her throat parched and her back aching from the unaccustomed posture. She had removed her bonnet earlier, tucking it into her bag, and now the sun had turned her face and neck an uncomfortable shade of pink, despite her efforts to shield herself. The water proved to be a small spring, barely more than a seep really, emerging from the base of a rocky cliff and forming a pool no larger than a wash basin before disappearing back into the thirsty earth. A single cottonwood tree, gnarled and ancient, provided blessed shade. Joaquin dismounted with fluid grace and helped Margaret down from her horse, his hands strong and sure on his waist. He led both horses to the tiny pool, allowing them to drink sparingly before tethering them in the shade. From a saddlebag, he produced a water skin and offered it to Margaret, who accepted gratefully. The water was warm but clean, and she drank deeply before returning it. Joaquin settled on a flat rock beneath the cottonwood, his stillness so complete that he seemed almost to become part of the landscape. "You knew my husband," Margaret said after a long silence, the statement rather than a question. Joaquin's dark eyes shifted to her face, assessing. "His journal mentioned someone called Jay, who he had confided in before his death. I think that was you." Joaquin didn't confirm or deny her assertion, his expression remaining impassive. Frustration welled up in Margaret, the culmination of months of uncertainty and grief. "Please," she said, her voice cracking slightly. "Thomas is dead. I'm alone with almost nothing. If you know something about what happened to him, I deserve to know." The plea seemed to reach something in Joaquin, for his expression softened almost imperceptibly, and he nodded once, a gesture so minimal she might have missed it had she not been watching him intently. "Your husband came to the reservation 3 days before he died," Joaquin said, his voice measured and calm. "He was afraid. He had found something in his mine. Something valuable, yes, but also dangerous." Margaret leaned forward, hanging on every word. This was the first concrete information she had received about Thomas's final days, a period when she had been visiting a sick friend in another settlement and had returned only to find him already buried beside the collapsed mine. He did not show me what he had found, Joaquin continued, dashing Margaret's rising hope for immediate answers. But he told me where he had hidden it, and made me promise to keep the location secret, especially from his partner. Pinkerton, Margaret supplied, and Joaquin nodded. But why would Thomas trust you with this secret? How did he even know you? The questions weren't meant to be challenging. Margaret was genuinely puzzled by the connection between her Boston-educated husband and this Apache man. Joaquin's mouth twitched in what might have been the ghost of a smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. He touched the silver medallion at his throat, drawing Margaret's attention to the inscription visible on its surface. For Valor, U.S. Army, 1864. The pieces kicked into place in Margaret's mind. Thomas was in the Army during the war, she said slowly. He was a mapmaker for the Union forces in the Southwest. He was more than a mapmaker, Joaquin said, his tone suggesting there were depths to Thomas Bennett that his wife had never suspected. He was a scout, like me. We worked together, tracking Confederate forces through Apache territory. The revelation stunned Margaret. Thomas had rarely spoken of his war service, and when he had, it had been in the vague terms of maps and surveys. Technical work befitting a professor of mineralogy. She had never imagined him in the role of scout, navigating hostile territory alongside native allies. We saved each other's lives more than once, Joaquin continued, the medallion gleaming in the dappled sunlight beneath the cottonwood. So when he came to me afraid, I listened. When he asked me to keep his secret, I agreed. Margaret's mind raced, reassembling her understanding of her late husband in light of this new information. Thomas the scholar, Thomas the dreamer who had dragged her west in search of silver that never materialized. He had been more complex than she had given him credit for. What did he find in the mine? She asked, returning to the central mystery. What was valuable enough for Pinkerton to kill him for it? For she was now certain that Thomas's death had been no accident, that the mine collapse had been engineered by his former partner. Joaquin's expression darkened, confirming her suspicion without words. He was silent for a long moment, seemingly weighing how much to reveal. When he finally spoke, his words were careful, precise. Your husband found a vein of ore unlike anything he had seen before, Joaquin said. Not silver, as he had been mining for, but something else. Something that glowed in the darkness with its own light. Margaret frowned, trying to make sense of this description. What mineral glowed in darkness? He believed it was dangerous, Joaquin continued. He had seen similar ore during the war in a secret government project. Men who worked with it became sick, their hair falling out, their skin covered in sores that wouldn't heal. A chill ran through Margaret despite the desert heat. Thomas had never mentioned such a project, but she remembered how he had sometimes awakened in the night, sweating and muttering about the blue glow and winter's folly, phrases she had attributed to meaningless nightmares. This ore, Margaret said, her mouth suddenly dry despite the water she had drunk. Thomas hid it in the mine? Joaquin nodded, his expression grave. And the location is in his journal? Another nod. Then Pinkerton wants the journal, not me, she concluded, relief flooding through her at the thought that she might not be in as much personal danger as she had feared. But Joaquin shook his head, dispelling that brief comfort. His next words froze the blood in her veins. Pinkerton doesn't just want the location, he said, his voice dropping lower, as if the desert itself might be listening. He wants the knowledge your husband had, how to handle the ore safely, how to sell it to those who would use it for weapons. That knowledge died with Thomas, but Pinkerton believes he shared it with you. The full weight of her situation crashed down on Margaret with terrible clarity. Thomas had discovered something so dangerous that he had hidden it away and confided only in a trusted wartime ally. He had died, been murdered to keep that discovery secret, and now Pinkerton believed that she possessed not only the location of the ore, but also the specialized knowledge to make it valuable. Knowledge she didn't have, couldn't have, since Thomas had never shared it with her. "But I don't know anything about this ore," she protested, a note of desperation creeping into her voice. "Thomas never told me. The journal just has maps and notes I can't decipher." Joaquin studied her face intently, as if searching for signs of deception. Whatever he saw there seemed to satisfy him, for he nodded once, decisively. "I believe you," he said simply, "but Pinkerton will not. To him, you are the only remaining link to the ore. He will not stop hunting you." The blunt assessment sent a shiver through Margaret, despite the heat. She had planned to escape to California, to the relative safety of her brother's home. But would even that distance be enough if Pinkerton was as determined as Joaquin suggested? As if reading her thoughts, Joaquin continued, "The stage you plan to take passes through 300 miles of territory where Pinkerton has contacts. You would not reach California alive." The matter-of-fact way he delivered this death sentence left Margaret speechless, her carefully constructed plan for survival crumbling before her eyes. "What can I do?" she asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. The question hung in the air between them, weighted with the desperation of a woman who had already lost everything but her life, and now found even that threatened. Joaquin's expression remained impassive, but something shifted in his eyes. A decision reached, a course of action determined. He rose from his seated position in one fluid motion and moved to his horse, retrieving a small leather pouch from his saddlebag. When he returned to Margaret, he held the pouch out to her, its contents clearly heavy from the way the leather strained against whatever was inside. "What is this?" Margaret asked, not reaching for it immediately. Something in Joaquin's manner suggested this was no casual gift, but a significant exchange. "A chance," Joaquin said, his voice steady. "Gold dust and nuggets, enough to take you far from here. Not California. Pinkerton would look for you there. North, perhaps, Canada, or south to Mexico." Margaret stared at the pouch, then at Joaquin, bewilderment written clearly on her face. Why would this man, practically a stranger despite his connection to Thomas, offer her such valuable assistance? As if sensing her confusion, Joaquin continued, "I owed your husband a life debt. Now I pay it by saving his wife." The explanation was simple, direct, and somehow more convincing than any elaborate justification might have been. Still, Margaret hesitated, her Eastern upbringing rebelling at the idea of accepting such charity, especially from a Native American. "I can't take your gold," she said, though her practical side recognized it might be her only chance for escape. "I have nothing to offer in return." Joaquin's expression didn't change, the pouch still extended toward her. After a moment, he spoke again, his tone unchanged, but his words carrying a weight that seemed to settle in the air around them. "Your husband died to keep dangerous knowledge from those who would misuse it. If you run, that knowledge remains scattered. The journal, which may lead to the ore, in your possession. The understanding of what the ore is and how to handle it, in mine. Separated, these pieces are useless to Pinkerton. Together, they could create weapons that would kill thousands. The moral calculation was clear, and Margaret found herself reaching for the pouch despite her earlier reluctance. The weight of it in her hand was substantial, enough gold to start a new life, perhaps even a comfortable one, far from the reach of Elias Pinkerton. "What about Thomas's journal?" she asked, suddenly conscious of the leather-bound volume in her bag. "Should I destroy it?" Joaquin considered the question, then shook his head slowly. "Keep it," he advised. "It may yet prove valuable to you, but remove the pages with the mind maps and give them to me. I will ensure they never fall into Pinkerton's hands." The request was reasonable, and Margaret nodded, retrieving the journal from her bag. With careful fingers, she located the relevant pages, 3 sheets covered in Thomas's precise mapping notations, showing the interior layout of the mine, and the location marked 3rd vein, west wall, behind false stone. She removed them from the journal and handed them to Joaquin, who folded them carefully and tucked them inside his shirt. The significance of the moment wasn't lost on Margaret. She was giving up perhaps her only chance to claim whatever valuable discovery Thomas had made. But the danger Joaquin had described outweighed any potential wealth. If Thomas had been willing to die to keep this ore hidden, who was she to undo his sacrifice? "What will you do with them?" she asked, as Joaquin secured the papers. "Burn them," he replied simply. "The knowledge of where the ore is hidden should die with those who already possess it." There was a finality in his tone that brooked no argument. Margaret nodded, accepting his decision as the right one. A thought occurred to her, a loose end that needed tying. "What about your nephew, Samuel? He knows about the journal, about my connection to Thomas. Will he be safe when Pinkerton discovers I've fled?" Concern for the station manager who had shown her kindness might have seemed misplaced given her own precarious situation, but Margaret couldn't help but worry about the ripple effects of her actions. Joaquin's expression softened slightly, the first real emotion he had displayed during their encounter. "Samuel can take care of himself," he said, a hint of pride in his voice. "He was a scout in the army, like me, like your husband. He knows how to disappear when necessary." This was yet another revelation. The quiet, efficient station manager had depths Margaret hadn't suspected. It seemed the men in her life, both past and present, had all harbored secrets beneath their ordinary facades. "He will return to the reservation for a time, until Pinkerton gives up and moves on to other schemes." Joaquin glanced at the sun, measuring its position in the sky. "We should go. The stage will pass the crossing soon, and you must not be on it." They mounted their horses and rode away from the spring, following a different route than the one they had taken from town. The terrain grew increasingly rocky, with towering mesas casting long shadows across their path. They rode in companionable silence, the gravity of the decisions they had made settling around them like an invisible mantle. Margaret found herself stealing glances at her companion. This Apache warrior, who had known a side of her husband she had never glimpsed, who was now altering the course of her life with the same calm certainty with which he navigated the desert. There was a dignity in his bearing that transcended the worn buckskin jacket and the silver medallion that marked his service to the army, that had ultimately confined his people to reservations. After perhaps an hour of riding, they crested a rise and looked down on a vast expanse of open country. In the distance, a thin ribbon of road wound its way between stands of mesquite and across dry washes. "The stage road," Joaquin said, pointing to where it disappeared behind a mesa some miles away. "It will pass that point in 1 hour. From there, it is 2 days to the next large town." He turned in his saddle to face Margaret fully. "You have a choice to make, Mrs. Bennet. You can take the stage as planned, hoping that Pinkerton does not catch up to you before California. Or you can ride north from here, avoiding towns and stagecoach stops, until you reach the railroad at Flagstaff. From there, you could go east to St. Louis, or continue north to Denver." The choice loomed before Margaret like a fork in the road made manifest. The stage represented her original plan, the path of least resistance, but also the path where Pinkerton would most expect to find her. The northern route meant days of hard riding alone through territory she didn't know, with only Joaquin's gold and her own determination to sustain her. It was daunting, but it also offered a freedom she had not experienced since leaving Boston as Thomas's bride years ago. "If I go north," she said slowly, testing the idea aloud, "I could start again somewhere new. No one would know me. No one would connect me to Thomas or his discovery." Joaquin nodded, neither encouraging nor discouraging her, simply acknowledging the truth of her words. "What would I become?" Margaret mused, the question directed more at herself than at Joaquin. A widow with no family, no connections. She trailed off, the limitations of her position in society pressing down upon her. In that moment, a memory surfaced. Thomas, in a rare moment of candor, speaking of his time during the war. "Out here," he had said, "a person can become anyone they choose to be. The past stays behind like footprints in the sand, washed away by the next rain." At the time, she had dismissed it as the romantic notion of a man trying to justify dragging his wife to the frontier. Now, with the prospect of reinvention before her, his words took on new meaning. "Am I too far gone?" she asked suddenly, turning to Joaquin. The question contained multitudes. Was she too far gone from civilization to return to it? Too far gone from the proper Boston lady she had once been to survive alone? Too far gone down a path of deception and flight to ever find peace? Joaquin studied her face for a long moment, his dark eyes seeming to see beyond her surface to the woman beneath. A woman stronger than even she realized, forged by grief and hardship into something resilient and adaptable. After what seemed an eternity, he spoke a single word in his native tongue, a word Margaret couldn't understand, but whose meaning resonated in the tone with which he delivered it. Natilif. The word hung in the air between them, a benediction or perhaps a prophecy. Margaret's hands began to tremble, not with fear, but with a strange, electric anticipation. She sensed that whatever Joaquin had said, it was significant, a truth about her that he perceived, and she was only beginning to recognize. "What does it mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Joaquin's expression remained steady, but there was a warmth in his eyes that hadn't been there before. When he translated, his voice carried a certainty that seemed to reshape the very air around them. "It means one who changes," he said, "one who transforms, like the butterfly from the cocoon, like the desert after rain." The words settled into Margaret like a seed finding fertile soil. One who changes, not too far gone, but rather perfectly positioned for transformation. The trembling in her hands spread through her body, not the tremor of fear, but the vibration of possibility. In that moment, with the vast Arizona landscape spread before her and the weight of Thomas's gold in her bag, Margaret Bennet felt something she had not experienced since before her husband's death. Perhaps not even since before leaving Boston for the untamed West. Hope. Not the desperate hope of the drowning person clutching at straws, but the steady, grounded hope of someone who sees a path forward, however difficult or uncertain. North, then, she said, the decision crystallizing with unexpected clarity. To Flagstaff, and then, we'll see. Joaquin nodded once, approval in the gesture. He reached into his saddlebag and withdrew a folded piece of paper, handing it to Margaret. She opened it to find a hand-drawn map, the trail to Flagstaff marked in precise detail, water sources, landmarks, places to avoid. 3 days' ride, Joaquin said, pointing to the northward trail. Follow the map. Travel by early morning and evening. Rest during the hottest part of the day. The mare is strong and knows the desert. He hesitated and then added, there is a woman in Flagstaff, Martha Redhawk. She runs a boarding house near the station. Tell her Joaquin sent you. She will help. The practicality of his assistance touched Margaret more deeply than any flowery promises of aid might have done. This was real help, a map, a connection, specific advice about how to survive the journey. Why are you doing this? She asked, the question escaping before she could consider whether it was wise or polite. Thomas is dead. Your debt to him, whatever it was, surely doesn't extend to giving me gold and helping me escape. Joaquin considered the question, his expression thoughtful. When he answered, his words were measured, as if he were choosing them with particular care. Your husband saved my life, yes, but there is more. The ore he found, it is poison to the earth. My people have known of such stones for generations and have avoided them. If Pinkerton finds it, he will dig it up and spread its sickness far and wide. The explanation resonated with a truth Margaret had sensed but not articulated. This was not just about a life debt or even about her safety. It was about preventing a greater harm, protecting not just individuals, but the land itself. I understand, she said simply. And she did, more deeply than she might have even days earlier. In the time since Thomas's death, her world had contracted to the most immediate concerns of survival: food, shelter, transportation. Now, paradoxically, in the moment of choosing a more difficult and uncertain path, her perspective expanded once more. There were larger principles at stake, responsibilities that transcended her personal comfort or safety. Joaquin extended his hand, palm up, not in the handshake of white society, but in a more ancient gesture of connection. After only a moment's hesitation, Margaret placed her hand in his, feeling the calluses and strength of a life lived close to the elements. No words were exchanged, but something passed between them nonetheless, an understanding, a recognition of shared purpose, despite their vastly different backgrounds. When they released the gesture, Margaret felt as if something within her had settled, like dust after a storm, revealing a clearer landscape than had existed before. She straightened in her saddle, adjusting her grip on the reins with new confidence. Nadili, she repeated, the unfamiliar word awkward on her tongue, but resonant in her heart. One who changes. Joaquin nodded, a rare smile briefly transforming his weathered face. He pointed to the northward trail, a barely visible track that wound its way between stands of juniper and across rocky terrain. That way lies your new path, he said simply. May it lead you to what you seek. Margaret took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the clear desert air. then nodded her thanks. Words seemed inadequate for the moment, for the transformation that had begun within her. Instead, she turned the mare's head toward the northern trail and nudged her forward, away from the stage road, away from her original plan, and toward an uncertain but suddenly expansive future. From the rise, Joaquin Two Knives watched as Margaret Bennett rode away, her figure growing smaller against the vast landscape. He had recognized something in her that perhaps she was only beginning to see in herself: a resilience, an adaptability, a capacity for transformation that would serve her well in the years ahead. The pages of Thomas Bennett's journal, tucked securely inside his shirt, would soon be ash, the location of the dangerous ore, forgotten as it should be. Pinkerton would rage and threaten, but eventually he would move on to other schemes, other victims. And Margaret, Nedelia, as he had named her, would forge a new life, far from the shadow of her husband's fatal discovery. As the distant figure disappeared behind a stand of junipers, Joaquin turned his horse toward the reservation, toward home. The silver medallion at his throat caught the sunlight, a reminder of debts paid and promises kept. The desert stretched around him, ancient and enduring, indifferent to the small dramas of human lives, but occasionally, as today, serving as the backdrop for moments of transformation. He spoke a brief prayer in his native tongue, asking the spirits of the land to guide the woman on her journey, then urged his painted horse forward, leaving no trace of his passing but hoofprints in the dust that would vanish with the next wind. Behind him, to the north, Margaret Bennett rode toward a future she could not yet imagine, but had chosen to embrace, not too far gone after all, but perfectly positioned to become someone new. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left.